Hello, I'm Simone Stolzoff. I am the author of a book called The Good Enough Job, which is right here. And it is my pleasure to be interviewing Josh Epperson today for a little bit of a retrospective. So, Josh was one of the character subjects in the book, and we're checking in about a year after the book has come out, both to learn about what has been new and updated in Josh's life since the book came out, and to hear about his thoughts on sort of career and work and life and how they've progressed. Since my book came out, Josh has gone on to write his own book, Living on the Edge of Time. He's also an exhibition writer and works with various museums around the country. So, Josh, thanks for being on today and for taking this time to think a little bit about how you're thinking about work has evolved.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you again.
So, in the book, I described this thing that you were running called the experiment. I'd love if you could just tell the audience a bit about what exactly the experiment was and where you were in your life when you started designing the experiment.
Sure. So I came up with this concept of the experiment in 2019, and I had just quit a corporate job that I'd been working for 7 years, making good money, being the busiest person. And I actually quit that job because I felt like I wasn't being valued as much as I thought sort of I guess I deserved really, or I thought my experience necessitated. And so I left that job thinking that I would go get another corporate job and jump back into sort of the same mix, seeking the promotion that I was denied, which was what made me feel sort of undervalued. And it was actually in a break from work that I started thinking about what I wanted to do and actually changed my mind. And I was convinced by some friends and others to work for myself. And so when I took on that direction, I extended my break to about 3 months. I saved up while I was working at this corporate job, so I kind of bought myself this break. It was certainly not for free, no trust fund to speak of, but it was in that extended break, sabbatical, if you will, that I came up with this thing, the experiment. And it was really a manifestation of reconsidering what work was to me and
Mm.
what I had defined it as. And I could define it differently. And I call it the experiment truly because I didn't know what would happen. This was truly experimental. I had a lot of doubts about what it was going to be. But to be more specific, the experiment was a concept of working where I wanted to make a good amount of money. And I love talking specifics about this stuff so that information like this can be pretty helpful. So good amount of money to me was between $70,000 and $90,000. It was a big cut from what I had been making, but I thought that that was an amount that could suit my life. So that was one parameter of the experiment. Another parameter was that I only wanted to work on projects that I found meaningful. And by that, I mean working on things for companies, for organizations that I wanted more of what they were doing in the world, and so that was the second parameter. And the third parameter was working basically half as much as I was working previously. And I had no idea whether or not that could be successful, but I thought, here's a chance to try to reimagine work for myself. And so that was the experiment that I started in August of 2019. So it's 5 years.
Wow, yeah, it's such a pleasure to be talking to you exactly 5 years after it began. I think since you started working this way, it's really captured the imagination of the general public. Both people in your community and people that you've never met before seem to really resonate with this approach, this way of working. And I'm curious why you think that is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's in the sort of the nomenclature of the experiment. It's
Mm.
an unknown, and what we do when we experiment, usually this language is from the world of science, and I'm not a scientist, but a big fan. And so how I understand experimentation is to play with something that is unknown or underknown and hoping that it would reveal something to us, that it'll uncover something to us. And it uncovered a ton for me. And I think, I share a good amount of that in your book, but there's kind of it's almost like I had a suspicion that it could never work. And when it started to work, I was shocked and I was almost doubtful that it could continue. But 5 years on, I'm quite convinced that there is another way to orient ourselves to work. And I think that that's what resonates with people. We're looking for escape from all of these tangles of systems that sometimes, suck more life out of us than give us an opportunity to thrive. And I think a lot of us are hungry to explore other ways to live our lives that allows us to take advantage of all that there is in the world instead of getting up every day, punching a clock, going through this, quote unquote rat race to get what in the end? Some disease when we're in our 60s and can't even enjoy retirement. And so I think a lot of people are looking for outs, and I wanted to experiment for my own good, my own well-being, what I could do. And so I think it gives people a glimpse into what's possible.
Yeah, so, I think success for you means you were able to, cut the number of hours you're working to 15 to 20 hours a week. You're able to continue to make good money and work on projects that you found personally meaningful. I imagine some people, maybe they're just being cynical, but would say, I don't know if this is attainable to me. Working less and making good money and working on meaningful projects sounds great, but I have reservations because I'm not sure how I'm going to pay for my health care, or I'm not sure how I'm going to support my kids or save for retirement. I'm sure you've talked to many people with these sorts of concerns and doubts over the years. How do you tend to respond? How do you tend to think about people who have these limiting beliefs about what they can and can't do with their jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I feel you is how I initially respond, because it is challenging. There are so many barriers to thinking about work differently. And, I kind of want to get into the specifics, because that's kind of how I answer this question. When you make it real for people, I think it's easier to swallow. Now, I do have to caveat in saying that I don't have children. And so I think that that's a scenario that I personally did not experiment with, but I do think that there are other ways to think about our work lives. Even if you do have children, that could allow us, something similar to what I got out of this. But, to start, it's a math problem. How many hours do I want to work is where I started. I kind of just shot in the dark, and I was like, I would love to cut it down by half or more, just to unleash myself from work and make it one of the smallest things in my life. So I, thought 20 to 30 hours a week could be a really great accomplishment through this experiment. And so then I slap a number on each one of those hours. So how much is my time worth? So, if I take, one of I have varying rates for various projects, but let's just go with a usual one, say $150 an hour. For me as a writer, that's a fairly standard sort of rate for projects that I would write on, and given my experience, etc. And so, $150, 20 hours, $150 an hour, 20 hours a week. What does that get me? Does it get me to my target? Now, if it does, great. There's the math. The initial setup is there. If I can get those 20 hours a week, then that'll be great. Now, that's where the sort of the rub is. If you're working for yourself, you got to make sure you're getting that. But most people aim to get a lot more than that. And so this was aiming to get a smaller number of work hours per week. And about 20 hours a week did get me in my range of where I want to be, given the number of weeks I want to work in a year. That math is accessible to all of us. Now, the situation I was in when I quit I was driving a Land Rover, which had a
Mm,
heavy, ticket on it, like a not parking ticket, but a heavy cost monthly. I was living in a really nice house, which had a monthly cost that was high. And so if I started doing that math about where I wanted to go and looked at my current bills, I thought, well, this really isn't going to work the way I'm thinking about it. So the big thing was to audit my life and say, can I do this more simply? And
mm,
so I did that. And I think this is the real rub. If people don't want to change their situation at all, it's going to be really tough to approach your work life differently. But if you're willing to adjust how much your life costs,
mhm,
then I think that there is a ton of potential. And so
mm,
I traded in my Land Rover for a Honda CRV, a very
mm,
reliable and much cheaper car, especially with the maintenance. I moved into an artist community. Obviously, that's not possible for every single person out there, but I looked for a way to have a living situation that was more shared, that was more community focused. And so the monthly cost and daily cost of living in a place where we share a lot of things is automatically a lot lower. And then I also adjusted how I spent my time. Did I go to bars as often as I used to? I did not. And I made a variety of other choices. So I brought the cost of my life down to the level of the cash that I was getting. And I
mm.
think that once I walk people through some of the specifics of that, it does, I think, seem more attainable. Now, the real trouble is getting used to all that time that you have once you start
Mm.
working less. And that is a real rub and was extremely surprising in terms of how I experienced that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're advising people to get clear on they actually need and how they might be able to live within their means given this new arrangement. I'm glad you brought up the aspect of time because that's sort of the other side of the equation, which is what does working for fewer hours allow for you? And so, especially in those early years when you first started doing the experiment, I'm curious a bit about what you learned. What did the experiment afford from other aspects of your life? And how did you continue to tinker with the experiment so that it really was working for you?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a ton, and the learning started immediately. We were often running with lessons from the very beginning. In my mind's eye, at the very beginning, I envisioned this. I envisioned this circumstance where I would wake up every day. I
Mhm.
have, far fewer meetings, sometimes no meetings at all, and truly Disney style. I'm thinking birds fly in from the window, pick up my covers off of me. I float to the bathroom and just, joyfully, gleefully move through every hour of my day because, I don't have much to do. My time is pretty unstructured. And God, it was the absolute opposite. It was almost stressful. And,
Mhm.
at the beginning, because the way I thought about rest, about free time, was that I wanted it so much coming from a world where every day was just stacked with meetings and things to do. I desired for that free time and that rest so much, but I hadn't experienced it in my entire adult working life.
Mm.
And so it was absolutely foreign to have hours and hours of free time. And at first it was quite unnerving. But I think what I began to realize was that was my conditioning. I had conditioned my whole life to every day serve the outcomes of an organization or a business or the people in my life. And it was a completely foreign thing to sit with that time and allow it for my own benefit. And
Mhm.
so I didn't run away from that discomfort initially. And I think I look back and I'm really glad that I didn't run away from that discomfort because it was very uncomfortable. But once I sat with it, I realized it was a story I had convinced myself that the purpose of my time was to serve some organization because that's all I had
Mhm.
practiced. And so I taught myself that that was the way to be. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized, like, do I believe that? Is that truly from my spirit center something that I believe? No, of course not. I believe that a human life is worth far more than just how it serves some capitalistic end. And so what I began to learn was, one, there's a process of pulling ourselves out of that habit and that conditioning, and comes at a cost, and the cost is a period of discomfort. But that period of discomfort does end, and 5 years on, I can say it ended probably within the first 6 months or 9 months or so. I think the thing I began to learn after that discomfort was, one, the value of time. And I had so little time when I was working all the time that I wasn't aware of just how much processing I was not doing of my own experience. A lot of my time was spent walking in nature, sitting at home with a drink in my hand. And what it allowed me to do was just contemplate, just imagine, just think about my own experiences. Sometimes it was, thinking about projects and, stressful situations. But a lot of time I was just allowing myself to catch up with myself and process the experiences I had had. So the value of just open, unstructured time really, really revealed itself to me. I obviously got convinced that there is another way to work. There is another way to do this. And if we're imaginative, we really can access that.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about how having the space to feel, having the space to process, having the space to synthesize can really benefit our personal growth and our ability to make sense of the world. I wonder what ways it might have benefited your work as well. One of the things that I often think about with modern knowledge work is so much of our time is accounted for in these 30-minute or 60-minute chunks, these little calendar blocks. But as we take in more and more inputs, we aren't necessarily giving ourselves the space to synthesize, to make sense, to think. And so in addition to having the space to walk in nature or contemplate things with a drink in your hand, I wonder how it affected your work life while you were working in those 20 or so hours each week.
Absolutely. In the corporate creative world, let me say, I worked in a branding firm. In that world, your first idea has to be your best idea, because you only have time to come up with a couple of ideas. The long, languid time of contemplation and consideration that you can really pour into a creative project or output with time on your hands is a completely different thing than when you have to jam it into a 2-hour block before a presentation. And I look at the work that I've done in the last 5 years, and I think it's some of my best. I've been able to do 4 powerful exhibitions that have been shown around the country. One of them about the Negro Motorist Green Book, with a major organization that's been traveling around the country for 3 years. I wrote that exhibition. I wrote 2 other permanent exhibitions in museums in Virginia and New York. I wrote a book, and just the energy and creative power that I could pour into my work counterintuitively created better work in less time. I could spend 20 powerful hours a week on my creative projects and get way better outcomes than working 50 hours a week trying to jam in 40 meetings and little here and there conversations about the work, and then only work on something for a good hour and a half of real focus work. And so I think the allowance of time to just pile up in reconsidering work, where you are spending less time on these tasks and these meetings and more time just allowing your mind to flow, it has had a dramatic effect. And I think it's some of my best work yet.
Yeah, very much so. I can see that. And, I think there's the business case of being able to have more space in our weeks, in our days, in our lives. But I think there's also the moral case. And I think this is a lot of what you talk about in the book that you wrote, Living on the Edge of Time. I'm curious sort of what inspired you to write the book initially, and in what ways was the book an extension or a continuation of what you were learning through the experiment?
Absolutely. I think if I did not work for myself in this way, if I did not transform the way I thought about work, I would have never written my book, Living on the Edge of Time. It just wouldn't have happened. The book idea came years before I started this experiment, the initial conception of it. And I had this conception of thinking about a way to reimagine how we make choices and put it into a framework that made sense for me and an average person as a way to guide themselves through their lives. We face so many distractions in our lives these days that actually making choices day to day can be really difficult. It can be so difficult that sometimes we just throw up our hands and relinquish our choices to the systems around us. We don't actively, intentionally make choices about how we're spending our time or what we're buying. And part of it's not really our fault. I think we're just so inundated just to protect ourselves, we, just relinquish. But I came up with a sort of way, a framework of thinking about choices that I think could help us in this time of distraction. And before the experiment, I had a completely different vision of the book. The book, in my mind then, it had a lot of me in it. I talked about my own life and I talked about my own career a ton. I was probably about almost 200 pages into that book before I started working for myself. During my sabbatical, I went back and I looked at that book, the draft I had of it, and I hated it. It was terrible. It wasn't resonating with me. It was only after I started working for myself, taking long walks day to day, having long hours of contemplation, that I started to imagine a different framework for this book. So the book is 48 pages now. It is sort of a simple philosophical guide to how we can think about our choices in a distracted world and how we can use them to build the life that we want. And I absolutely used the core principles of this book to shape the life that I have now. I used the book that I wrote to craft this experiment and this new approach to working. And it's been a joy, but also really just a success. I've done it. I've done the transformation. And I'm really excited to continue the path and see how long it can happen.
Yeah, very much so. It's interesting that you started the experiment back in 2019 because this seismic event happened just 1 year into it, which was the pandemic. And I think for everyone, regardless of what type of work they did, the pandemic was this great sort of reconsideration, helped people rethink their relationship to work. And now we're sort of coming out of the thrust of the pandemic, and we live in a different world, both given the growth of things like remote and hybrid work, but also because with a tighter labor market and higher inflation and company layoffs, the sort of sense of worker empowerment, the vibe has shifted a bit recently. And so I'm curious, as you're 5 years into experiment now, how your perspective has or hasn't changed about the need for this continued reconsideration of our relationship to work. In what ways do you think the pandemic was a catalyst for larger systemic and personal change? And in what ways is the rubber band just going to snap back to the way things were maybe in 2018 or when you were first considering the experiment in the initial days?
Yeah, I think that I gotta be honest. I don't think we've fully taken on the lessons we learned during the pandemic.
Mm.
I remember the time when everybody was reconsidering how we are approaching our lives. I mean, people were finally at home. And, let me not make light of the pandemic or its impacts on people's lives. A lot of people died. A lot of family members were lost. And in that way, it was a horrible time. And a lot of people were forced into situations where they had to expose themselves to a disease day in and day out and had no choice about it. So that reality, I think, is something that we wanted to move away from. It was a painful time. And so I don't blame us for wanting to kind of just get past it and go back to living and getting back out there in the world. I mean, I've done it, but there are some lessons to be learned from that time. And I think it's worth asking those questions we had about our lives again and again, and to continue to pursue them. I do think that the pandemic changed a lot. I mean, your book, I have people reach out to me fairly often. They'll be reading your book because they're thinking about questioning their work life or trying to imagine a different way of working. And they'll reach out and say, one, I had no idea you were in this book. Are you the Josh Epperson? Is this just another guy named, it's like, no, it is me. It is me. And I'll get into conversations about how I transform my way of working and how a lot of people are reimagining. I get emails all the time that say, I'm thinking about the same thing and I want to reimagine. Thanks for sharing your story. And I think that speaks to this desire that I spoke to earlier, which is I think a lot of people don't feel in control of how their lives are oriented. And I think one argument I make in my own book, Living on the Edge of Time, is that we really do have a lot more control than I think we give ourselves credit for. But we don't have a lot of evidence of how to do it differently. And so to me, my experiment, I had the privilege of trying it out with the confidence that if it failed, I think I could probably go get a job and, return to work life. But at the beginning, I thought, I'm going to try this for 5 years and see what happens. And here we are 5 years on, and I've learned a lot of lessons. There's definitely stuff I need to improve on. So it hasn't all been amazing. There's been some stress and some trouble, but largely it's been successful. And I just hope that we can share more stories and more ideas about how we can reimagine, because we shouldn't lose that energy. We have the power to reshape our economy, reshape our culture. We've done it a ton of times before. This is not the only version of America or Western society that we've had. And so the power is there. It's just a matter of taking the risk, stepping off the ledge, and really giving it a shot through doing your own experiment with work and with life and seeing how you can transform it to get more out of life as opposed to just serving work all the time.
Yeah, very much so. I think one of my favorite lines from the book was that we've negotiated our relationship to work before, which means that we can do so again. Things that we think of as set in stone, like the 9 to 5 work day or the 40-hour work week or the 2-day weekend. These are all things that are the result of organized labor, the result of people who have made choices and band together to advocate for their own rights. And who's to say that more change isn't on the horizon? I want to talk about sort of systemic level and policy changes in a second. But first, let's go back to the individual. So say someone sends you an email and says, hey, Josh, the experiment sounds great and I want to try it for myself. What are some of the biggest pieces of practical advice, both how to go about designing an experiment for yourself, but also some of those maybe principles that you keep in mind as you have gone through this process yourself? What are some of those pieces of maybe hard-earned wisdom that can help people who are just starting out?
Yeah, I think the first piece of advice I give to someone trying to do their own experiment with transforming the way they work is think about what kind of life they want to live. And I think that that's what I had the opportunity to do when I took a sabbatical before I started working for myself. And my conclusion was that I wanted to have experiences of awe and adventure. That's the stuff that, as time rolled on, as I went through my days, that was the stuff that really woke me up and really spoke to my spirit. And so I would encourage anyone reconsidering it, think about practically, what do they want their days to look like? And for me, it was getting outside. It was seeing art. It was great meals with my girlfriend. So that's what I wanted. And I think there's a million answers, a million correct answers to how someone would want to live their life. But without that kind of vision for what you want out of your own life, it's hard to know what you're aiming towards with a work transformation. Then getting to the practical matter of what's the math? How much can you practically charge for whatever it is that you do? And then how much time do you practically need to dedicate to your work to make it sustainable? Getting that math really, really clear was massively helpful for me. But one thing I learned, and this is where I think the failures, quote unquote, of the experiment, I think were primarily that I was broke more often than I wanted to be in the last 5 years, because working for myself was so new. I mean, I had to get used to so many things that, for all of my career, my professional life as an adult, I got a check every 2 weeks. And I gotta say, I miss those days only for the consistency. But working for yourself, you have to be in charge of connecting those checks. And that took a lot of time for me to learn. And I still haven't really nailed it. I think there's natural ebbs and flows to an entrepreneurial life and, trying to connect those dots. So if you're doing it in a way where you're working for yourself, I think considering that is really, really beneficial. And I think having a little bit of extra cash, whether it's in the stock market or it's in a savings account or what have you, is essential. I have sold stock in the 5 years that I've been working for myself to make some of those ends meet. And so that's just a really practical piece of advice. But I will also say it's not joyful at all times. And I like to tell people, you have to choose your hard. Working in a corporate space where you're busy all the time is a certain type of hard. Working for yourself, where you have a lot more free time, but you have to connect the checks, you have to pay for your own health insurance, et cetera, it's just a different kind of hard. I don't think that we can get through life without some suffering, without some pain day to day or week to week. But I think we can choose the type of hard that works for us. And even though I've thought that there were certainly moments that were really difficult throughout this experiment, it is a type of hard that I would choose again every time.
Yeah, so I heard three things. One is to start by thinking about what is the life that you want to live, which I think is so important. I think so many people start with what is the job that I want to have, and everything else about their lives get pushed into the margins. But I like this sort of start with thinking about the life you want to live and then how your work can support that life. The second thing I heard was to give yourself some cushion. So maybe it means saving up some money preemptively, thinking about other sources of income that can provide that padding as you stumble the inevitable sort of learning process of figuring out your experiment for yourself. And the third is thinking about which trade-offs you want to accept, what type of hard you're willing to take on. And I think it's really refreshing to not have this sort of simplified picture of the sort of self-employed life where everything is rainbows and bunnies versus the corporate grind. There are things about having a 9-to-5 job that are very comforting and give you a sense of security, give you a sense of community, give you a sense of direction. But you can't have all of the good without some of the bad. I think that's a really well put lesson. I want to talk a little bit about the broader implications of reconsidering our relationship to work. And so, I'm sure you've gotten asked a lot about things like the 4-day work week or different sort of experiments that are happening around the world. I wonder if you are thinking from the perspective of a leader or a policymaker, what are some of these changes that you think can be made on a systemic level that would afford people the ability to do more experimentation with their lives?
Yeah, I think, you talk about the our 4-day work week in your book, and to the extent that I've researched it, looked into it on my own, it seems like all those experiments are positive. It seems like the people who participate in them feel like they're better at their jobs and that they have more time to care for what's in their lives. With those 3 days that they can have as, sort of the longer weekend or a time to just take care of the things that exist outside of our work lives. There's something to that. They're doing these experiments scientifically for a reason, because you can trust the information, and invariably it's positive results. So I'm thinking something like a 4-hour work week is absolutely a policy pursuit that I think should be supported. However that's subsidized, however that it can be encouraged in the corporate world, I think it's worth pursuing, regardless of the policy. And I think things like honestly a universal basic income. I think, again, the experiments that have been done with that, absolutely. You give people money without any prerequisites, without any demands on them, and they will spend it positively in the majority of cases. And I mean vast majority of cases. I think we're so suspicious of one another that if we give anything away that will take it off and ruin it, or ruin ourselves, or waste it, gamble it, what have you. And I think we should give ourselves more credit. I think most of us want to just thrive in our lives, and we invest in that. Mm. But I think backing out of the policy idea, and you invited me to think as a leader, maybe a policymaker, politician, etc. Why do they exist? What are we doing as a society? Are we just trying to wake up much money and objects as possible? Are we trying to just get by, just get out of the way of danger and catastrophe? Is that the point of the society? I would argue that the point of the society is to do the most good and have the most thriving for the most amount of people. And we've made technological innovation after technological innovation over millennia to allow ourselves that eventual goal of having the time to thrive. We have gotten so obsessed with work that we think it is the point of life. Whereas all the research tells us relationships are the thing that make us well, are the thing that support our lives. Art and artistic pursuits enliven our lives. Cultural manifestations, whether it's invention, whether it's wellness pursuits, whether it's spirituality, these are the things that if we have the time that we pour ourselves into, we have not only number of workers, but the technology to pursue thriving as a society. And any politician or leader who is not focused on the most amount of people thriving has their own agenda, I think. And so I think if you're really a leader who really believes in the betterment of the society, ways we can think about work and getting work out of the way of living and focusing on living and thriving for the most of us I think is what should lead our policy. And I think there's a ton of ways we could approach work differently that could deliver that.
I love that. Yeah, and I definitely see how for individuals their lives can truly benefit if they didn't have to spend as much time, as much of their weeks or their lives working. But I also wonder how it might change the world that we live in, how it might change our neighborhoods and our cities and our communities and even our families. I wonder if you could spend a moment kind of painting a picture what a world with less work might look like.
I think a world with less work could really be a beautiful thing. Let's be practical. I still want plumbing. I still want, if a tree falls on my house, I would love to be able to fix that and to have the supply chains and the expertise and the infrastructure for that to be remedied. And so a life with less work or a world with less work would still have work in it. And I think that there's a necessity to a lot of our work that we can't really get out of the way of. I know some carpenters and some plumbers and some contractors and, construction workers, that sort of thing, who love that sort of work. I dream of a world where the people who want to do these particular types of work are the ones doing it. And the people who don't want to do them and want to do other things are doing those things. That's the vision of the world that I dream of, that we actually can all do the necessary in our lives to allow for the extraordinary in our lives. And so I think a world with less work looks like us getting together and spending time with people that we love more often. I mean, you look at the rates of loneliness in America just alone, and it's incredible. There's more of us than ever, and we are more disconnected than ever. That the math of that is mind-boggling to me. There's more people to meet, and yet we're not doing it. I think work is in the way of our connection in a lot of ways. But I also think a world with less mandatory sort of task-oriented work looks like a lot of people working on things that they really believe in. I love what I do for work. I'm a real, if I had all the time in the world, and I've, lived in a few months where I had all the time in the world, I wanted to write. I wanted to explore. I wanted to write a book about philosophy and thinking about our choices. It took a lot of editing. It took a lot of, strain to produce that work, but it was fulfilling work. And so I really do think that a world with less work, yes, has less tasks in it, less demands of our time to be on meetings or deliver, reports, etc. But I do think it has more meaningful work in it. So I think we connect with ourselves, but I dream of a world where we just have the time to create. I dream of the incredible art and engineering that could come out of a world where people have the time to think and imagine.
That's beautifully said. So to close, I'm curious what you think the future of the experiment is. You're 5 years in. Do you plan to keep going? Where do you think you might be 5 years from now?
Yeah, well, I will say to you in this public way for the first time, the experiment has concluded. I had the duration in mind at the very beginning that it would be 5 years. And so I'm taking the lessons I've learned in the lab, if you will, and now I'm going to try to see if I can continue to live my life in this way. I do need, the lessons I learned about connecting the money in the best way possible. I'm still learning those lessons, and I probably have to tick up the amount that I work week to week in some seasons of my life to make sure that I'm not broke, that I get to have the experiences that I want. So it's possible to work a ton less, but I think I'm finding that balance of working certainly less than I was, but not so much less where I'm struggling to, make the ends meet. So that's a
Mm,
big lesson for me, is to kind of do what's necessary to have that consistency. But this is a way of life for me now, and I'm going to continue to pursue it. And I'm going to see what else is revealed. Because of the pandemic, I said at the beginning that I wanted to find these experiences of awe, wonder, and adventure. And I've certainly had a million awe-inducing experiences, whether it's with, my girlfriend, whether it's with family members, or by myself. But I haven't had the opportunity to have as much adventure. The pandemic really put a damper on the amount of adventure I could pursue in my life. And so, what I really want to do, and I have some plans already, is to really push the limits of how much adventure I can bring into my life. I'm preparing for a long sailing expedition of 22 days coming up in October. And I want to explore just how many ways I can get out into the world and live in a more adventurous way. So that's on the horizon. But with the experiment done, I'm excited to continue to question how I work, explore how I work, and work less and live more.
mm.